What's up, everyone? Welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to share a story that came from a patrol officer with 9 years on the job, someone who's taken thousands of emergency calls throughout his career. What happened during one seemingly routine shift was officially logged as a welfare check resulting in a confirmed suicide. Standard procedure, case closed, but what really happened during that phone call, the words that were spoken, the weight of that conversation, that's something that never made it into any report. Before we get into it, I want you to think about something. When someone calls 911, we assume they want to be saved. We assume they're asking for help. But what happens when someone calls not to be rescued, but simply to be heard one last time? To confess, to say goodbye, to make peace before they're gone. This is the kind of story that changes how you see every emergency call, makes you wonder what's really happening on the other end of the line. If you like this kind of content, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you're watching from. Now get ready, because this call will stay with you long after you finish listening. Let's get into the story. Most calls you take during a shift fade from memory once you clock out. You answer dozens of them every night: domestic disturbances, medical emergencies, noise complaints, traffic accidents. After 9 years doing this job, they all blur together into a constant stream of human crisis and mundane problems. You learn to compartmentalize, to not take the work home with you, to maintain that professional distance that keeps you sane. But there are some calls that break through that barrier, calls that refuse to fade, calls that change something fundamental in how you see the job. This was one of them, and I've carried it with me every single day since. That night started like any other Tuesday, late shift, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., the graveyard shift we all rotated through. The city was relatively quiet, typical weeknight activity, a few bar fights, couple of fender benders, nothing out of the ordinary. I was partnered with Rodriguez that night, good cop, solid guy. We'd worked together for 3 years. We just cleared a domestic call, false alarm thankfully, when dispatch sent us back to patrol our sector. I was driving, Rodriguez was doing paperwork, and I was thinking about how I had only 4 more hours until I could go home and sleep. The radio crackled around 2:17 a.m., dispatch saying they had a strange call. Someone asking to speak to an officer, not reporting an emergency exactly, just wanted to talk to a cop. That happens sometimes. Lonely people calling 911 just to have someone to talk to, usually elderly folks, sometimes drunk people, occasionally someone having a mental health episode. Dispatch asked if we could take the call, transfer it to our mobile unit, see if it was anything that needed in-person response. I said sure, told them to patch it through. Rodriguez looked up from his paperwork, raised an eyebrow. I shrugged. Figured it'd be a 5-minute conversation and we'd move on. The call transferred to my handset. I answered professionally. "This is Officer Reeves. I understand you wanted to speak with an officer?" There was silence for a moment, then a man's voice came through, calm, measured, almost gentle. "Yes, thank you for taking my call, officer. I appreciate your time." His tone was polite, formal, like he was calling customer service, not emergency services. No urgency, no distress, just an eerie calmness that immediately felt wrong. I've learned to trust my instincts about voices, and something about his voice set off quiet alarms in my head. "What can I help you with tonight, sir?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral, professional. There was another pause. I could hear him breathing, could hear background noise, maybe traffic, maybe a TV. "I'm not sure you can help me, officer, but I felt I needed to speak to someone official, someone who would remember." That phrasing struck me as odd, someone who would remember. I glanced at Rodriguez. He was watching me now, sensing something off too. "Remember what, sir? Are you in some kind of danger?" I was trying to assess if this was a mental health crisis, trying to figure out the best approach. No danger," the man said, almost amused. "Well, not from anyone else anyway." That statement hung in the air, heavy with implication. "Sir, can you tell me your name and where you're calling from?" Standard protocol, establish identity and location. My name doesn't matter much anymore, but it's Arthur Brennan. And I'm calling from my apartment. I'm looking out the window right now. The city looks beautiful at night. Have you ever noticed that, officer? His voice had a dreamy quality, like he was somewhere else mentally. I was starting to feel that familiar dread, the sense that this call was going somewhere dark. Arthur, are you thinking about hurting yourself? I asked directly. No point dancing around it. There was a long silence, so long I thought the connection had dropped. Then he spoke again, voice still calm. I suppose I am, yes, but that's not really why I called. I called because I needed to tell someone something. I needed to make sure something gets done after I'm gone. And I felt a police officer would be the right person to ask. My chest tightened. I was signaling Rodriguez to call dispatch to start tracing the call. This wasn't just a lonely person wanting to chat. This was a goodbye call. Arthur, I need you to stay with me. I want to help you, whatever's happening. We can work through it, but I need you to tell me where you are exactly. I was trying to keep him talking, buying time for the trace. I'm at 4782 Riverside Drive, apartment 3B. I'm sitting by the window. I've been sitting here for hours thinking about everything, about all the choices I made, all the things I got wrong. His voice was steady, no tears, no breaking, just a sad acceptance. Arthur, I'm sending someone to your location right now. I want you to let them in. I want you to talk to them. Can you do that for me? He laughed softly, not a bitter laugh, just tired. I appreciate what you're trying to do, officer. I really do, but I didn't call to be saved. I called because I have a request, something I need done. And I need to know someone will do it. My hands were gripping the phone tight. Rodriguez was on the radio coordinating units to Arthur's address. What's your request, Arthur? Tell me what you need. I was trying to keep him engaged, trying to give our guys time to get there. I have a letter. It's on my kitchen table. It's addressed to a woman named Margaret Hayes. I need you to deliver it to her, and I need you to make sure I get a dignified burial. That's all I ask. His request was so specific, so calm, it threw me completely. Arthur, I can make sure those things happen. But first, I need you to wait for the officers I'm sending. They're coming to help you. They'll be there in just a few minutes. I was stalling, trying anything to keep him on the line. You're a kind man, officer. I can hear it in your voice, but you and I both know how this ends. I made my decision 3 days ago. I've been preparing, getting everything in order. 3 days. He'd been planning this for 3 days. I felt sick, felt the weight of what was happening settling over me. Arthur, why Margaret? Who is she to you? I was trying a different approach, trying to get him to talk about something personal, something that might anchor him to life. He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, there was emotion finally bleeding into his voice. Margaret was the only good thing that ever happened to me. I met her in 1967. In Vietnam, I was a soldier. She was a nurse. We fell in love in the middle of that hell. His voice softened with memory. We were going to get married when we got home. We had plans. We had dreams. What happened? I asked gently, genuinely wanting to know, needing to understand why this letter was so important to him. I came back different, officer. The war took something from me I couldn't get back. I couldn't sleep, couldn't connect with people, couldn't be the man she deserved. He paused. I heard him take a shaky breath. I loved her too much to destroy her with my damage, so I left, just disappeared from her life, never explained, never said goodbye. It's been 51 years and I've regretted it every single day. The pain in his voice was palpable now. Decades of regret compressed into those words. Rodriguez was listening to dispatch on the radio. Units were 3 minutes out. I needed to keep Arthur talking for 3 more minutes. So the letter? It's an explanation? An apology? I was trying to keep him focused on the letter, on Margaret, on something outside himself. It's both, and it's a confession. I need her to know that leaving her wasn't because I didn't love her. It was because I loved her too much. I need her to know she wasn't the problem. I've always been the problem. His voice was getting quieter, more distant. I've lived 51 years alone. Officer, no wife, no children, no family. Just me and my memories and my mistakes. Arthur, have you tried to reach out to Margaret before? Have you talked to her at all in these years? I was genuinely curious now, invested in this story despite the circumstances. No, I've known where she is for decades. I've driven past her house. I've seen her from a distance, but I could never bring myself to face her, to explain why I destroyed what we had. He sounded exhausted, like he'd been carrying this weight so long he couldn't hold it anymore. She got married 3 years after I left, had children, had a whole life, a good life from what I could tell. And that's what I wanted for her. She deserved happiness. Then why the letter now? Why after all these years? I asked, trying to understand his reasoning. Because I'm tired. Officer, I'm 73 years old. I'm alone. I'm sick. Not terminally, but enough to know my time is limited anyway. And I realized I couldn't die without her knowing the truth. His voice was firm now, resolved. I couldn't let her spend the rest of her life thinking I didn't love her, thinking she wasn't enough, because she was everything. She was the only light I ever had. And I need her to know that before I go. The conviction in his words was heartbreaking. This letter was literally his dying wish. I heard dispatch in my earpiece. Units were pulling up to the building now, but I also heard something else in Arthur's background, a scraping sound movement. Arthur, what are you doing right now? I tried to keep my voice calm, but I felt panic rising. I'm standing on a chair, officer. I'm in my living room. I've prepared everything. It won't take long. It won't be messy for whoever finds me. My blood ran cold. He was about to do it right now while I was on the phone with him. Arthur, please, get down from the chair. The officers are at your building right now. Just wait. Just talk to me for one more minute. I've waited 51 years, officer. I've talked to myself for 51 years. I'm done waiting. I'm done talking. His voice was steady, accepting, peaceful even. But I need your promise. I need to know you'll deliver that letter to Margaret. I need to know she understands why, that she knows she was loved. That's all that matters to me now. I was gripping the phone so hard my hand hurt. I could hear Rodriguez on the radio telling units to break down the door if necessary. I promise, Arthur. I promise I'll deliver the letter. I promise she know. But please, just wait. Just give me one more minute. Thank you for listening, officer. Thank you for caring. You're doing good work. Keep doing it. His voice had a finality to it that made my stomach drop. Arthur, please, I started, but he interrupted gently. Deliver the letter to her and give me a dignified burial. That's all I ask. That's my last request. And then I heard it, a sound I'll never forget, a sudden movement, a crash, the phone clattering to the ground. I was yelling into the phone, Arthur, Arthur, but there was no response, just silence, just the distant sound of splintering wood as officers broke down his door. Rodriguez and I sat in the patrol car, both of us listening to the radio traffic, hearing what we already knew was coming. Unit 23 to dispatch. We have a confirmed 10 to 56 male, approximately 73 years old, appears to have been deceased for less than 5 minutes. Suicide. The clinical language couldn't mask what had just happened. I'd been on the phone with a man while he killed himself. I'd heard it happen. My hands were shaking. I set the phone down, stared at the dashboard. Rodriguez put his hand on my shoulder, didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. Dispatch asked if we wanted to respond to the scene. Rodriguez looked at me. I nodded. We needed to go. I needed to see it, needed to process it somehow. The drive to Arthur's apartment took 12 minutes, felt like hours. Neither of us spoke. The radio chatter continued. Medical examiner was being called. Crime scene would need to be processed even though it was clearly suicide. I kept replaying the call in my head, his calm voice, his polite requests, the way he thanked me before he died. Had I said the right things? Could I have kept him talking longer? The questions were already eating at me. We pulled up to the building, typical mid-rise apartment complex, older construction, looked like it had seen better days. Several patrol units were already there, lights flashing, small crowd of neighbors gathering despite the late hour. Rodriguez and I headed up to the third floor, met Officer Chun at the door of 3B. "It's not pretty," she warned, her face pale. "He did it in the living room, hanged himself from a ceiling beam. Chair kicked over beneath him." I took a breath, steadied myself, walked in. You never get used to death scenes, not really. Each one carries its own weight. The apartment was neat, almost obsessively so, everything clean and organized. The living room was small, sparsely furnished, and there he was, Arthur Brennan, hanging from a rope tied to an exposed beam, his face already showing signs of lividity. I'd seen hanging victims before, but this felt different. This one I'd spoken to, this one I'd heard take his last breath. The medical examiner's team was already there, starting their work, photographing everything. I forced myself to look away, to focus on why I was there. The letter. He'd said it was on the kitchen table. I walked to the kitchen, small galley style, table pushed against the wall. And there it was, exactly as he'd described, a white envelope, slightly yellowed with age. Addressed in careful handwriting, Margaret Hayes, 2847 Oak Street, Millbrook, PA. The handwriting was neat, precise, the kind you don't see much anymore. Next to the envelope was a note written on lined paper. Same careful handwriting. "To whoever finds this, please ensure the enclosed letter reaches Margaret Hayes. Please ensure I receive a dignified burial. My affairs are in order, documents in the bedroom drawer. I have no family. Thank you." Simple, direct, his final instructions. I picked up the envelope carefully. It was sealed. Probably had been for days or weeks while he worked up the courage to go through with this. Rodriguez came into the kitchen, saw what I was holding. That the letter he mentioned? I nodded. "He made me promise to deliver it, Rodriguez. He made me promise with his last words." Rodriguez looked at the envelope, then at me. "You know, we can't just deliver personal mail. There's a process. It goes to next of kin, or if there's none, it goes through the estate. We can't just—" He stopped, seeing my face. "You're going to deliver it anyway, aren't you?" He asked for two things, a letter delivered and a dignified burial. That's it. That's all he wanted from this world before he left it. I was holding the envelope like it was fragile, like it might disintegrate. "I heard him die, Rodriguez. I was on the phone with him. I heard the exact moment. And I promised him, I gave my word." Rodriguez sighed, ran his hand through his hair. "This is going to be a problem. You know that, right? Chain of custody, evidence protocols. We can't just take things from a death scene." He was right. Technically, this was evidence. It would need to be logged, photographed, potentially examined. I looked at the envelope again, thought about Arthur's voice, about the 51 years of regret he'd carried. I'll log it, I'll photograph it, I'll document everything. But then I'm taking it to Margaret Hayes. I don't care what the protocol says. Rodriguez studied me for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Okay, but we do it right. We cover our asses. We make sure everything is documented so nobody can say we contaminated a scene or stole evidence." We went back to the patrol car, got the evidence kit, photographed the letter from every angle, logged it officially, then I took it. Broke protocol. Didn't care. The rest of the scene processing took hours. The medical examiner confirmed time of death was approximately 2:23 a.m., 6 minutes after Arthur's call to me had started, 3 minutes after I'd heard him fall. The detective assigned to the case, Morrison, someone I'd worked with before, took my statement. I told him about the call, about the promise, about the letter. He looked at me skeptically. "You can't just deliver personal correspondence from a suicide scene, Reeves. You know that." I met his eyes. "I already took it. It's logged. It's documented, and I'm delivering it. You can write me up if you want. But I'm doing it." Morrison didn't write me up. Just shook his head and told me I was making things complicated for no reason. But he didn't understand, hadn't been on that call, hadn't heard Arthur's voice, hadn't made that promise. I went home after my shift ended, couldn't sleep, kept hearing Arthur's voice in my head. kept thinking about his last words. My wife asked if I was okay. I told her about the call, about the promise I'd made. She held my hand, told me to do what I thought was right. I loved her for not questioning it, for understanding that sometimes you have to break small rules to honor bigger promises. The next day I did research on Arthur Brennan, wanted to understand who he'd been. Found his military records. He'd served 2 tours in Vietnam infantry, had been awarded a Bronze Star and a Purple Heart, came back in 1969, had worked various jobs over the years, mostly manual labor, lived alone, never married, no children. His last employment was 15 years ago. He'd been living on veteran benefits and Social Security since then. No criminal record, no history of mental health treatment documented, no red flags that would have put him on anyone's radar. Just a man who'd lived quietly with his ghosts until he couldn't anymore. I researched Margaret Hayes too, found her easily enough. She was 72, lived in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, small town about 2 hours from the city. She was a widow. Her husband had died 5 years ago. She had 2 adult children, 3 grandchildren. She'd worked as a school nurse for 30 years before retiring. Her social media presence was minimal, but what was there showed a normal life. Family gatherings, grandchildren's birthdays, book club meetings. No indication she'd been waiting for 51 years for a letter from a man who disappeared from her life. Maybe she'd forgotten him, moved on completely. Or maybe she'd thought about him every day like he'd thought about her. I took a day off, told my sergeant I needed personal time, didn't explain further. Got in my car early in the morning, started the drive to Millbrook. Rodriguez had offered to come with me, but I felt like this was something I needed to do alone, a promise I'd made personally. The drive was quiet, rural Pennsylvania countryside, farmland, and small towns. I kept the letter in my jacket pocket, could feel it there constantly, a weight that wasn't physical. I rehearsed what I'd say 100 times in my head, but none of it sounded right. How do you deliver a letter from a dead man to a woman who hasn't heard from him in half a century? Millbrook was exactly what you'd expect. Quaint small town, tree-lined streets, old houses with front porches, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone. I found Oak Street easily. Number 2847 was a modest 2-story house, white siding, blue shutters, well-maintained garden. I sat in my car for 10 minutes, gathering courage. This felt harder than delivering death notifications to family members, harder than any other aspect of the job I'd done. Finally, I got out, walked up the path to the front door, rang the bell. I heard movement inside, then the door opened, and there she was. Margaret Hayes looked younger than 72, gray hair cut short, bright blue eyes behind reading glasses, wearing a cardigan and slacks. She looked at me curiously, probably wondering why a police officer was at her door. "Can I help you?" she asked, voice kind but cautious. I introduced myself, showed my badge, explained I was from the city, that I was there about someone from her past. Her expression changed slightly, curiosity mixed with concern. "Who?" she asked. I took a breath. "Arthur Brennan, ma'am. I need to talk to you about Arthur Brennan." The reaction was immediate. All color drained from her face, she grabbed the doorframe for support. "Arthur," she whispered, the name coming out like a prayer or a curse. I couldn't tell which. "Is he dead? Please tell me, is Arthur dead?" The fact that her first question was about his death told me everything I needed to know. She'd carried him with her all these years, had never fully let go. "Yes, ma'am, I'm sorry. He passed away 3 nights ago. He took his own life." Her eyes filled with tears immediately. She put her hand over her mouth, a sound escaping that was part sob, part gasp. Somehow I knew. I woke up that night feeling like something had shifted in the world. She was crying now, tears streaming down her face. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry to bring you this news, but Arthur asked me to do something before he died. He asked me to deliver a letter to you." I pulled the envelope from my pocket, held it out to her. She stared at it like it might burn her, then slowly, carefully took it from my hands. Her fingers traced over her own name written in Arthur's handwriting, fresh tears falling. He wrote to me. After all these years, he finally wrote to me. She looked up at me, eyes full of pain and questions. Did he suffer? In the end, did he suffer? I thought about his voice on the phone, the calmness, the acceptance. No, ma'am, I don't think he did. I think he was at peace with his decision. Would you like to come in? She asked, voice shaking. I think I need to sit down, and I think I need someone here when I read this. I don't want to be alone for this. I nodded, followed her inside. The house was warm, comfortable, family photos everywhere, grandchildren's artwork on the refrigerator, a lived-in space full of love and history. She led me to the living room. We sat down. She held the letter in her lap, just staring at it. I waited so long for him to explain. I waited years, and then I stopped waiting. I moved on. I built a life, but I never forgot him. She looked at me, searching my face. Did he tell you anything about us? I told her about the phone call, about what Arthur had said, about Vietnam and the love they'd shared and his reasons for leaving. She listened, crying quietly, nodding occasionally. I knew it was the war. I knew it had changed him, but he wouldn't talk to me, wouldn't let me help. And then one day he was just gone. No explanation, no goodbye, nothing. Her voice broke. I went looking for him. I filed missing person reports. I hired a private investigator. But he disappeared completely, and after a few years everyone told me to move on. Told me he was probably dead, so I tried. She wiped her eyes. I met my husband Tom 5 years later. He was good to me. We had a good life together, but there was always a part of me that belonged to Arthur, a part I could never give to anyone else. She opened the envelope carefully, unfolded the letter, several pages covered in the same neat handwriting. She read silently, more tears falling, her hands shaking slightly. I sat there quietly, giving her space, feeling like an intruder in this private moment, but knowing Arthur had wanted someone there, had wanted an official witness to this final communication. After several minutes, she finished reading, carefully refolded the letter, held it against her chest. He loved me, she said softly. All these years he loved me. He left because he loved me too much to hurt me with his pain. She looked at me with those blue eyes, now red from crying. He was wrong, of course, leaving hurt worse than anything else could have. What did he say in the letter? I asked gently, curious about what 51 years of silence had produced. She wiped her eyes, took a breath. He explained everything about the nightmares, the flashbacks, the guilt over things he did in the war, how he couldn't sleep next to me without waking up screaming, how he couldn't be intimate without panicking, how he watched me trying to help him and saw himself dragging me down into his darkness. She paused, composing herself. He said leaving me was the hardest thing he ever did, harder than anything in the war, but he convinced himself it was the right thing, that I deserved someone whole, someone who could give me a normal life. He watched me from a distance for years. Did you know that? She continued, anger mixing with sadness now. He wrote that he'd drive by my house, see me with my husband, with my children, see that I was happy, and to confirm for him that he'd made the right choice. Her voice hardened. But he never asked me what I wanted, never gave me the choice. He decided for both of us that his damage was too much, and he robbed me of the chance to help him, to love him through it. She was right. Of course, Arthur had made a decision for both of them, had taken away her agency in the name of protecting her. Did he say why he reached out now? Why after all this time? I asked. She looked back at the letter. He said he was sick, not dying, but sick enough to know his time was limited, and he realized he couldn't die without me knowing the truth, without me understanding that I wasn't the reason he left, that I was perfect, that leaving me was about his weakness, not mine. She pressed the letter to her chest again. He said I was the only good thing that ever happened to him, that every good memory he had included me, that he'd lived his whole life regretting his decision but believing it was the right one. Her voice dropped to a whisper. He said he hoped I'd been happy. That was all he wanted, my happiness, even without him. I let her sit with that for a moment, then asked the question I needed to ask. Ma'am, Arthur's other request was for a dignified burial. He had no family, no one to handle arrangements. Would you be willing to help with that, to give him a proper funeral?" She looked at me surprised, then nodded firmly. Of course I will. He should have had me at his side all along. The least I can do is be there at the end." Her voice was stronger now, resolved. "Where is he now? What needs to be done?" I explained the process, the medical examiner's office, the release of the body, the arrangements that would need to be made. "I'll take care of it," she said with certainty. "I'll bring him here, bury him next to Tom if the kids agree. Or I'll find another place, but he won't be alone, not anymore." We sat together for another hour. She told me stories about Arthur before the war, about their time in Vietnam, about the man he'd been before the trauma broke him. She showed me a photo she'd kept all these years, hidden in a box in her closet, Arthur in his uniform, young and smiling, arm around her, both of them looking at the camera with such hope. "I've looked at this picture 10,000 times, she said softly, wondering where he went, if he was alive, if he ever thought about me, and now I know. Now I finally know." She held the photo next to the letter, two artifacts of a love that had survived 51 years of silence but couldn't survive the weight of one man's guilt. Before I left, she asked me about the phone call, wanted to know his exact words, his tone, what his last minutes had been like. I told her truthfully that he'd been calm, peaceful even, that he'd thanked me for listening, that his last words were about making sure she received the letter and that he received a dignified burial. "He always had good manners," she said with a sad smile. "Even at the end, he was polite, considerate, thinking about everyone but himself." She walked me to the door, gave me a hug, thanked me for bringing the letter, for keeping Arthur's promise. "You're a good man, officer. Arthur was right to trust you." I drove back to the city in silence, emotionally exhausted, feeling like I'd witnessed something profound and painful. Arthur's apartment had been cleaned by then, his few possessions boxed up, everything prepared for estate sale since he had no heirs. The department had closed the case, suicide, no suspicious circumstances, no further investigation needed. But I couldn't close it in my mind, couldn't stop thinking about Arthur's voice, about Margaret's tears, about 51 years of unnecessary separation because one man couldn't forgive himself for being broken by war. I thought about all the what-ifs. What if Arthur had gotten help? What if he'd let Margaret in? What if he'd called me sooner? Could I have talked him down? The days after delivering the letter were strange. I found myself unable to focus on regular patrol work. Every call I took, I listened more carefully, tried to hear what wasn't being said, tried to detect if someone was saying goodbye rather than asking for help. Rodriguez noticed, pulled me aside after a shift, asked if I was okay. "That call got to you," he said, statement not a question. I nodded, didn't try to deny it. I keep thinking I could have done something different, kept him talking longer, said the right words, convinced him life was worth living. Rodriguez shook his head. "You can't save everyone, Reeves. You know that. Some people make their decision before they ever pick up the phone. But knowing that, intellectually and accepting it emotionally were two different things." I started researching suicide prevention, reading studies, trying to understand what I'd missed, what signs I hadn't picked up on. The data was clear. When someone has made a concrete plan, has prepared their affairs, has said their goodbyes, the intervention success rate drops dramatically. Arthur had spent 3 days preparing, had written his letter, had organized his apartment, had made his peace. By the time he called me, he wasn't asking to be saved, he was asking to be witnessed. I'd been a confessor, not a rescuer, and I hadn't understood that in the moment. I talked to the department psychologist, mandatory after a suicide call like that. She listened to my description of the conversation, asked how I was processing it. "It sounds like you did everything right," she said gently. "You tried to keep him talking, you had units respond. You made a human connection with him. Sometimes that's all we can do. But I felt like I'd failed somehow. Felt like there must have been magic words I didn't say, perfect phrases that would have changed his mind. The guilt you're feeling is normal," she continued. But it's misplaced. Arthur's decision was about pain he'd carried for 50 years. It wasn't about your 10-minute conversation. You didn't fail him. Margaret called me 3 days later. She'd made arrangements for Arthur's funeral, asked if I would attend. I know it's unusual, she said, but you were the last person to speak with him. You heard his final words. I think he'd want you there, and honestly, I'd like you there too. I agreed immediately, felt like I owed it to Arthur to see this through, to make sure his second request was fulfilled as completely as the first. The funeral was scheduled for the following Saturday at a small chapel in Millbrook. She'd arranged for Arthur's body to be transported from the city, had selected a burial plot in the local cemetery. I drove back to Millbrook that Saturday, wearing my dress uniform, the one reserved for official ceremonies and funerals. The chapel was small, maybe 20 people there, mostly Margaret's family and friends who'd come to support her. A few veterans from the local VFW post who showed up whenever a fellow veteran was being buried. Arthur's casket was simple but dignified, American flag draped over it, photo of him in his uniform from the 60s placed nearby. Margaret sat in the front row, her children on either side of her. She saw me come in, gave a small wave, gestured for me to sit with them. The service was brief. A chaplain spoke about sacrifice and service, about the wounds that don't show, about the silent suffering of men who came home from war but never really left the battlefield. Margaret had asked to speak. She stood at the podium, looked at Arthur's casket, and spoke from her heart. I loved this man 51 years ago, and I never stopped loving him. Even when I didn't know where he was, even when I built a life with someone else, a part of my heart always belonged to Arthur Brennan. Her voice was steady, strong. He made choices I didn't agree with. He left when I needed him to stay. But I understand now that he was trying to protect me. Even if his method was flawed, Arthur carried pain that would have broken most people, she continued. He served his country, saw things no person should see, did things no person should have to do, and when he came home, we as a society failed him. We didn't give him the support he needed. We didn't acknowledge his wounds. We told him to move on and be normal, and when he couldn't, he thought the problem was him. She looked around the small chapel. Arthur deserved better from us, from his country, from the people who sent him to war, and I hope wherever he is now, he's finally found peace, finally laid down the burden he carried for so long. She sat back down, her daughter holding her hand, tears streaming down both their faces. After the service, we processed to the cemetery. A military honor guard from the local VFW performed flag-folding ceremony, presented the flag to Margaret. They played taps, the sound echoing across the quiet cemetery, birds singing in nearby trees. Arthur was buried in a plot Margaret had purchased next to a space she'd reserved for herself. Tom is on the other side, she explained quietly. The three of us together, all the loves of my life in one place. It was unconventional but felt right somehow. The headstone was simple. Arthur James Brennan, 1951 to 2024, beloved, finally at peace. Margaret had chosen the inscription carefully, wanted it to acknowledge that peace had eluded him in life but found him in death. After everyone else had left, Margaret and I stood by the grave together. "Thank you for being here," she said. "Thank you for everything you did, for bringing me the letter, for helping me understand, for giving Arthur what he asked for." I told her I was just doing what felt right, what I'd promised. "It was more than that," she insisted. "You could have just logged that letter as evidence, let it disappear into some property room. You went out of your way to honor a dead man's wishes. That says something about who you are." I didn't feel like I deserved the praise, still felt like I should have done more, should have saved him somehow. "Can I ask you something?" Margaret said, looking at the fresh grave. "Do you think he was happy in those last moments? Do you think he felt relief?" I thought about Arthur's voice, the calmness, the sense of resolution. "I think he felt peace," I said honestly. "I think he'd made his decision and accepted it. I think delivering that letter and knowing you'd understand was all he needed." She nodded, tears falling again. I wish he'd reached out years ago. I wish he'd let me help him. But I'm grateful he thought of me at the end, that I was important enough to be his last request. We stood there in silence for a few more minutes. Then she thanked me again, hugged me, and I left her there alone with Arthur, finally having the conversation they never got to have in life. The drive back to the city felt different this time, like I'd closed a circle that had been opened the night Arthur called. I'd fulfilled both his requests. The letter had been delivered and read. The burial had been dignified and meaningful. He'd been honored as a veteran and mourned by someone who loved him. But the weight hadn't lifted. If anything, it felt heavier. I kept thinking about the 51 years between when Arthur left Margaret and when he finally explained why. 51 years of unnecessary suffering for both of them. All because one man couldn't accept that being broken didn't make him unworthy of love. How many other people were out there right now, carrying similar burdens, pushing away the people who cared about them because they believed their damage made them unlovable? I went back to work the next week, tried to fall into routine, but everything felt different. I listened to calls with different ears now, heard desperation I'd missed before, heard goodbye in words that seemed innocuous. An elderly woman calling about a noise complaint who mentioned she didn't have anyone to call if she had a real emergency. A middle-aged man asking about parking regulations who casually mentioned he'd been thinking about his mortality lately. These probably meant nothing. Probably were just random conversational asides. But now I heard them, noted them, followed up when I could. Rodriguez said I was becoming paranoid, said I couldn't save everyone, said I needed to compartmentalize better. But I didn't want to compartmentalize better. Didn't want to return to hearing emergency calls as just routine tasks to be processed. Arthur's call had changed something fundamental in how I understood this job. We aren't just responders to immediate crises. Sometimes we're the last voice someone hears, the last human connection someone makes, and that carries responsibility I hadn't fully appreciated before. I started volunteering with a crisis hotline on my days off, got training in suicide prevention, learned techniques I wish I'd known during Arthur's call. The trainer said I was a natural at it, said I had empathy and patience that made people trust me. I thought about Arthur, wondered if he'd given me that gift in his death. Margaret and I stayed in touch. She'd call every few weeks. We'd talk about Arthur, about grief, about moving forward. She told me she'd shared the letter with her children, wanted them to understand this part of her history they'd never known about. They'd been supportive, understanding, had even said they were glad she'd found closure after all these years. Her son asked questions about Arthur's military service, wanted to understand what his mother's first love had experienced. Margaret appreciated that curiosity, that willingness to honor someone they'd never met. "You changed our family story," she told me once. "You brought Arthur back into it, gave us context we didn't have, helped us understand parts of my life I'd never fully explained." She also told me about reading the letter repeatedly, finding new meaning each time. "He wrote about specific memories I'd forgotten," she said. Little moments from Vietnam, conversations we'd had, promises we'd made. Reading his recollections brought them back to me. It was like being young again for a few minutes, remembering what it felt like before everything got complicated. The letter had become precious to her. She'd had it professionally preserved, kept it in a safe box, planned to pass it to her daughter eventually. "It's a reminder," she explained, "that love doesn't die just because circumstances change, that the connections we make with people echo through our whole lives, that we touch each other in ways we don't always realize." 6 months after Arthur's death, I was working a night shift when we got called to another potential suicide. Someone had called 911 saying goodbye, had hung up before we could get details. We traced the call, rushed to the address, arrived to find a man in his 40s sitting on the floor of his apartment, bottle of pills spilled beside him but not taken yet. I sat down next to him, didn't rush, just asked if he wanted to talk. He told me about his depression, his divorce, his job loss, how everything had collapsed and he couldn't see a way forward. I listened, really listened. Then I told him about Arthur, about the call. about the regret and isolation and how Arthur had spent 51 years alone because he couldn't accept help. The woman who loved him never stopped loving him, I said. She would have helped him, would have stayed with him through the darkness. But he never gave her the chance. He decided for both of them that his problems were too big, and they both paid for that decision for the rest of their lives. The man listened, tears streaming down his face. I don't want to be alone, he whispered. I don't want to push everyone away. I told him he didn't have to. Told him accepting help wasn't weakness. Told him people who love you want to help carry your burdens. We sat there for 2 hours talking until he agreed to go to the hospital voluntarily to get evaluation and treatment. Rodriguez had arrived as backup. He helped coordinate transport, gave me a look that said he understood why I'd shared Arthur's story. I don't know if that man got better. Don't know if my words made a difference long term, but he didn't take those pills that night, and that was something. I've told Arthur's story a dozen times since then, to people in crisis, to other officers, to anyone who'll listen. Some people say I'm too emotionally invested, that I need better boundaries, that I'll burn out if I care this much about every call. Maybe they're right, maybe I am too invested, but Arthur's call showed me that every conversation matters, that the words we choose can echo through someone's life, for good or ill. I'd rather care too much than not enough. I'd rather err on the side of human connection than clinical detachment. Margaret sent me a Christmas card that year, a photo of her whole family, grandchildren included, with a note saying Arthur would have been glad to know his story might help others, that his death might not be entirely meaningless if it could prevent someone else's. She included a copy of a photo she'd found, Arthur as a young man before the war, bright-eyed and smiling, full of hope and possibility. She'd had it enlarged and framed, kept it on her mantel alongside photos of her late husband and her children. They all have a place in my home, she'd written. All the people who shaped my life, all the loves I've known, Arthur included, finally given his rightful place after too many years in the shadows. I kept that photo on my desk at the station, a reminder of why this job matters, of why paying attention matters. Some of the other officers asked about it. I told them the story. Some understood. Some thought I was being dramatic. That's okay. Not everyone needs to understand, but I needed to remember. Every time I answered a call now, I thought about Arthur's voice, his calmness, his final words. I thought about the promise I'd made and kept, about Margaret's tears, about 51 years of unnecessary suffering. And I listened, really listened, to every person who called, trying to hear what they were really saying, trying to catch the goodbyes before they became permanent, trying to be the witness they needed, even if I couldn't be their savior. A year after Arthur's death, I got a call from Margaret, her voice excited in a way I hadn't heard before. I found something, she said. I was going through some old boxes from my parents' house, stuff I'd stored away decades ago, and I found letters. Letters Arthur wrote to me from Vietnam. Letters I'd kept and forgotten about. She'd spent the week reading them, comparing them to the final letter he'd sent through me, seeing the arc of a man's life through his own words written 56 years apart. He was so full of life in these early letters, she said, voice breaking. So hopeful, so in love, you can see the war changing him as the letters progress. See the darkness creeping in by the last few letters before he came home. He's already starting to pull away. She wanted to do something with the letters, create some kind of legacy for Arthur beyond his pain and his suicide. I'm thinking about donating them to the Veterans History Project, she explained. The Library of Congress collects stories from veterans, preserves them for history. I think Arthur's story deserves to be preserved, the whole story. The love and the war and the aftermath, all of it. She asked if I'd write about my experience too, about the phone call, about delivering the letter, about the funeral. Your perspective matters, she insisted. You were there at the end, you witnessed his final act of love, that's part of his story too. I agreed to write something, felt honored to be included in Arthur's legacy. I spent weeks writing about that night, about the phone call, about hearing Arthur die while I was trying to save him, about the promise I made and how I kept it. I wrote about Margaret's grief and grace, about the funeral, about how one man's story had changed how I saw my job and the people I served. The writing was cathartic, helped me process emotions I'd been carrying for a year, helped me find meaning in what had felt like failure. When I sent it to Margaret, she called me crying. "This is beautiful," she said. "This honors Arthur, shows he wasn't just his death, he was his love, his service, his struggle, and his final act of reaching out." The letters in my account were submitted to the Veterans History Project, accepted and preserved. Arthur's story was now part of the historical record, accessible to researchers, to other veterans, to anyone seeking to understand the lasting wounds of war. The anniversary of Arthur's call came. I requested that night off, drove back to Millbrook, visited his grave. Margaret was there too. We'd planned it without discussing it, both of us drawn to mark the day. She'd brought flowers. I'd brought a photo from Arthur's apartment that I'd kept. Arthur in his uniform receiving his Bronze Star. We placed the items on his grave, stood there in comfortable silence. "Do you think he knew?" Margaret asked suddenly. "Do you think he knew how much his call would affect you? How his story would spread? How his death might help others?" I thought about his words, his careful planning. "I think he hoped," I said. "I think that's why he called a cop instead of a hotline. He wanted someone official, someone who might follow through, someone who might make his death mean something beyond just another suicide statistic." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "He succeeded then. His death meant something. Meant a lot, actually, to me, to you, to the people you've told his story to the researchers who'll read his letters someday." She looked at the headstone, the simple words she'd chosen. "I used to be angry at him for leaving," she admitted. "Angry that he chose his pain over our love. Angry that he robbed us of 51 years we could have had together. But I'm not angry anymore. I understand now that mental illness and trauma aren't choices. That Arthur was fighting a battle I couldn't see, and he did the best he could with the tools he had." She paused. "I wish he'd had better tools, better support, better treatment options. But I can't change the past. I can only honor who he was and what we meant to each other." We left the cemetery together. She invited me to dinner with her family. I accepted. Around her dinner table, surrounded by children and grandchildren, she told stories about Arthur, about who he'd been before the war, about their time together. The family listened, asked questions, wanted to understand this piece of their mother's and grandmother's history. Margaret's son, James, a high school history teacher, said he'd started incorporating Arthur's letters into his Vietnam War unit, using them as primary sources to help students understand the personal cost of war. "The students respond to it," he said. "They see Arthur as a real person, not just another statistic. It makes the war real to them in a way textbooks don't." Arthur's story was teaching a new generation, helping them understand exactly what he would have wanted. I kept working patrol, kept volunteering with the crisis hotline, kept telling Arthur's story when it felt relevant. Some people I encountered thanked me for sharing it, said it helped them understand their own struggles or their family members' struggles. I got letters from veterans who heard the story, who related to Arthur's pain, who said knowing they weren't alone in their struggle meant everything. One veteran, a man from the first Gulf War, wrote that Arthur's story convinced him to finally seek therapy for his PTSD, that he didn't want to end up alone and broken like Arthur had been. "Your story about him helped me see that accepting help isn't weakness," he wrote. "I owe Arthur my life, in a way. His story saved mine." That letter meant more to me than any commendation or award, proof that Arthur's death had prevented others, that his final act of reaching out had rippled outward in ways he never could have predicted. Rodriguez and I talked about Arthur sometimes during long patrol shifts. He'd seen how the call had changed me, had watched me become more engaged, more present in the work. "You're a better cop now," he said once. "More human somehow, like you see the people instead of just the situations." I told him Arthur had taught me to listen differently, to hear what isn't being said, to recognize that every call might be someone's last reach for connection. "You're going to burn out," Rodriguez warned. "Caring this much, it'll eat you alive eventually." Maybe he was right. Maybe caring this much wasn't sustainable. But I couldn't go back to how I'd been before. Couldn't unhear Arthur's voice. Couldn't forget the weight of that promise I'd made. If burnout was the price of being fully present, I'd pay it. The department noticed the change too. My supervisor called me in for a performance review, said my empathy with callers had been noted multiple times, said dispatch had commented on how I handled difficult calls differently. "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it," he said. "We need more officers who connect with people, who see them as humans in crisis instead of just problems to solve." I thought about telling him about Arthur, about how one call had reshaped my entire approach, but decided against it, kept that story for the people who needed it, not as a professional achievement, but as a human connection. Arthur's legacy wasn't something to put on a resume. It was something to carry forward, to honor in how I treated every person I encountered. Years pass, I'm still doing this job, still answering calls, still listening for the unspoken goodbyes. I've had other difficult calls, other people in crisis, other moments where I wondered if I said the right thing, did enough, made a difference. But Arthur's call remains unique, remains the one that taught me what this job really is beneath the protocols and procedures. We're not just emergency responders, we're witnesses to human suffering, to human courage, to final acts of love and desperation. Every call matters because every person matters, because you never know when you're someone's last connection to the world, last chance to be heard, last opportunity to feel like they mattered to someone. Arthur taught me that, paid with his life to teach me that, and I carry that lesson with me every single shift. Margaret still calls sometimes. We've become friends in a strange way, bound together by Arthur's memory. She's in her late 70s now, talks sometimes about mortality, about joining Arthur and Tom eventually. "When I go," she told me recently, "I want you at my funeral too. I want the person who connected Arthur and me at the end to be there when I follow. You're part of our story now, whether you intended to be or not." I told her it would be my honor, meant it completely. She's become important to me, a reminder of grace under grief, of the capacity to forgive and understand even when you've been deeply hurt. She loved Arthur through his absence, loved him through his death, continues to love him in memory. That kind of enduring love is rare and precious and humbling to witness. The letter itself, Arthur's final words to Margaret, I think about it often. Those pages contained 51 years of regret, explanation, and love compressed into a final message. How do you summarize a lifetime of feeling in a few pages? How do you explain decades of choices and pain and loneliness? Arthur had done it somehow, had found words that gave Margaret peace, had managed to communicate across time and death and silence. That letter was his last gift to her, carefully crafted, painfully honest, and ultimately healing despite the tragic circumstances. It reminds me that words matter, that communication matters, that telling people you love them matters, because you never know when you won't get another chance. Don't wait 51 years like Arthur did. Don't let fear or shame or pride keep you from reaching out, because someday it'll be too late and regret is a heavy burden to carry. Arthur's final words to me echo still. Deliver the letter to her and give me a dignified burial. I kept that promise, fulfilled both requests, but in doing so I received something in return, a deeper understanding of why this job matters, why being present matters, why listening matters. Arthur's call was his goodbye to the world, but it was also a beginning for me, the start of a new way of seeing the work, the people, the sacred responsibility of being someone's last voice on the other end of the line. I hope I honor that responsibility every day. Hope I live up to the trust Arthur placed in me with his final words. His death wasn't meaningless, wasn't just another tragedy in a world full of them. It taught lessons, changed lives, rippled outward in ways both measurable and invisible. That detail never made it into the official report, but it's the truest thing about that night, the most important thing, the thing that matters most. Some calls change you forever. This was mine.